Hi everyone, welcome to our Mark's Gospel series and today to chapter 2. In the first chapter, Jesus is introduced to us as the one who, as God's Son, comes into our world with all of God's authority. And he's willing to use that authority to make people whole. Now you might wonder that anyone would try to stand in his way, but in chapter 2 we see the first instances of opposition to Jesus. It's this opposition that will eventually result in his crucifixion. The chapter begins with a very significant story that we want to take a little bit more time on because it shows us both the extent of what Jesus comes to do and who he is. He's teaching in a house and some friends bring a paralyzed man to have him healed. The friends can't get near because of the crowd. They climb up onto the flat roof and they dig their way through and they lower him down to Jesus. I can't help but wonder what the owner of the house was doing while all of this was going on. Now, the man was coming seeking healing. If you'd asked anyone in the room what the best thing that could have happened to him would be, I'm pretty sure they would have said that he could walk again. But Jesus says in verse 5, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, this is so significant. First of all, it tells us about our needs as people. Jesus is almost triaging this man and addressing his deepest needs first. So he's saying that greater than any physical need we have is the need for forgiveness, the cancelling of the sin that stands between us and God. But Jesus is also saying that he's the one who's able to do that. And that is no less than a claim to divinity, and the religious leaders who are there rightly see that. They're thinking in verse 7, who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, the problem with claiming that someone's sins are forgiven is proof. How can you know? And that explains what's happening next. Jesus asks, which is easier to say, your sins are forgiven, or take up your mat and walk? Well, it's actually easier to say your sins are forgiven. If you say walk, the evidence has to be there or you'll be shown to be a fraud. Jesus then does heal the paralyzed man, and as he does that, he shows that by doing the thing that requires proof, that the other thing, forgiveness, has really been given. And so we can be sure of the truth of what Jesus says in verse 10, the Son of Man, that's one of the ways he commonly refers to himself, the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Then we see Jesus calling another disciple, Matthew, and again there is controversy with the religious leaders because Matthew's a tax collector and that was a class of people who were despised and seen as morally compromised. But Jesus eats with him and his tax collecting friends, and the religious leaders say that he's hanging out really with the wrong sort of people. But Jesus says in verse 17, it's not the healthy who need a doctor but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, we shouldn't think that there are some people who don't need Jesus and some people who do. That's not what he's saying. No, all are sick, all are sinners, but some do not see this about themselves and then therefore put themselves outside of the scope of Jesus' rescue. Throughout the remaining verses in the chapter, these sorts of challenges continue to come from different people. The particular areas in question are the practice of fasting and Sabbath observance. And people are clearly trying to find categories for Jesus and his teaching, but they're struggling to do that. Jesus uses the illustration about the folly of putting a new patch on an old garment or new wine into old wineskins. In other words, the commonly accepted ways of trying to relate to God, relying ultimately on your own effort, religious or moral, those are deeply flawed and hopeless. What Jesus is doing can't be incorporated into that way of thinking at all. He's doing something entirely new. He's coming to rescue people, not to give them suggestions as to how they might better rescue themselves, because they can't. That's a remarkable claim, as is the claim to be the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath pointed to God's deep and everlasting rest, and Jesus is really saying here that he's the one who can provide that. So what we see in this chapter cuts across the commonly accepted thinking, both then and now. We don't easily see that our greatest need is forgiveness from God. We don't easily see that Jesus is the only one who can bring that. Rather, we tend to try to fit him into our existing categories, of trying to earn our way into God's good books. But that just won't do. That wouldn't be good news, because it would really just be saying, try harder. And the good news is not try harder. The good news is not work harder. It is that Jesus has worked for us. The good news is not do, it is done. Read chapter 3. I'll see you tomorrow.